Hello everyone, welcome back to another session by K21 Academy. Today our expert trainer will be talking about infrastructure as code. So let's get into the video.
Let us understand what is infrastructure as a code. So infrastructure as a code is a type of an IT setup where a DevOps teams can automatically manage and provision the infrastructure for an application through a configuration file or a software code. It simply means that all the infrastructure required to run your application can be created through a code. That is what is called as an infrastructure as a code. Now, what are the infrastructure required to run an application? Now, if you take a simple typical example of a web application, I would need a virtual machine, I would need a load balancer, I would need a database, I would need an auto scaling, I would need a Route 53, right? These are the various services or core services you would need to create a web application on AWS. Now these services, the core services what I listed out, 5 core services, these are called infrastructure to run my application. I have an web application created, I want to run that. Where will I run it? So in order to run that application, I would need all these services. Now, what if I say that I can create all these services through a code where I write a lines of code and give it to a CloudFormation service, and CloudFormation service is going to create all these core services for me. And then once all the infrastructure is done, then I'm going to deploy my application to it. So that is where your infrastructure as a code comes into picture. So here it is major benefit for a DevOps team because here you don't have to rely on the infrastructure team for it. It benefits the DevOps team by allowing the operation to evolve in a development process. Now, for example, let's say it is not only that every time you change things in your application, there are few scenarios where you have to change things in your infrastructure as well, like capacity. Now you set up an infrastructure with a 10 GB capacity. Now it is not it is not sufficient for the customers or end user. There is a demand for 20 GB capacity. Now for that, what you do, you normally go ahead, change the infrastructure. But how about change that in a manner of development process, like the way we change in our DevOps lifecycle, we change and add a new feature. Similarly, you can also do a change of your infrastructure using a development process from beginning, and developers to gain better understanding of a supporting infrastructure. It also helps the developers to gain a better understanding of a supporting infrastructure. Now, what used to happen previously is that development team is to create a code and then they give it to the ops team, and the ops team is going to install it in the infrastructure. And when something goes wrong, ops team is going to say that okay, the application it's a mistake from a development team, where the development team did not code it properly, so that is why the application is not working as expected. Now the development team will put it on the operation team, saying that we had developed our code as per the requirement, and it is working in my local machine, it is working in my testing machine, and everything is working. It is not working in production machine. It means that the operation engineer has done something different in the production environment. That is why it is not working. So these things used to happen several years back, and due to which it is going to elongate your process of software development life cycle. And that is where the DevOps team came into picture. Even when the DevOps team came into picture, the developer team has to be aware of the infrastructure what they are running on. They need to understand how your infrastructure react to the application code. So if you know how it works, then only you can tailor made your code according to that, right? Now I cannot expect, if I have written an application code, if that particular application code is running on my local machine, it does not mean that it is going to run similarly if I put that application into the Lambda, or if I put that application into a EC2 virtual machine. Not necessarily, right? Because the configuration of my local machine is different, the platform or operating system is different compared to where that particular application code is going to deploy on AWS. Now that is where the problem comes into picture. Now if the development team is aware of the infrastructure, then they can easily tailor make their code, and accordingly they can build their code. So this will help the DevOps team to improvise their process. And these configuration file contains compute, storage. As I said, it can be compute, storage, network, application services that comprise an operating environment. Now, as I said, the core service is what I listed out. Anything you require to run an application, all those core services required to run your application, that will be present in this configuration file. And the other thing is that we might be thinking now, considering okay, there might be 5 or 6 services. and that is not a big deal to create manually or anything as such. But in the medium-sized companies or an enterprise companies, large-sized companies, it's a different picture altogether. So there will be n number of services you will have to configure. Even if you go for a microservice architecture or anything as such, there will be several number of services, and every services has their own n number of configurations. Now, when you start doing it manually, it is always prone to errors, right? Manual errors, it is always prone to error because you might not remember what was the configuration of one particular service, how it has to be integrated, how it has to be done. You might not remember. You might have a proper documentation. You might need to follow the step and do it, but still, human negligence or human errors is pretty vital. So what it happens with using infrastructure as a code, it will eliminate the manual configuration drift through the automation, thereby increasing the speed and agility of your infrastructure deployment. Now, if you use an infrastructure as a code and you set up an infrastructure, and let's say there is some problem in that particular infrastructure, and you go ahead and make it changes manually, that will not be allowed in the infrastructure. So what it is going to do, it is going to cause a drift, and it is going to give you a notification saying that somebody is trying to change manually. And then later on, if it has to be done, it has to go through a proper cycle where you will have to make the changes in the code, and that code changes has to be approved by a different team or a team lead or an application owner, and then only, or an AWS owner, and then only you can incorporate that particular infrastructure changes. Now just imagine, now as I said, I've been telling this, any changes you make to the AWS services, right? So that is your responsibility. Now just imagine there is a critical application like Netflix is running on my AWS account, right? And now one of the developer or one of the engineer logged into my AWS account and made some changes to the infrastructure, right? Because he's having a permission, so he made some changes. Now what will happen? It is pretty obvious that it is going to affect my application, and my Netflix application starts working different or weird. Now, can an enterprise companies like Netflix can afford it? Absolutely not. So that is why what they do is they're going to go through the infrastructure automation process where any manual changes will not be entertained. Now, even that is how all the enterprises plans. Only the POC environment or a testing environment is where you will be allowed to make changes through. You'll be allowed to make changes manually. Rest everything you will have to do to the code only. So the code, what you write, it will be verified with your lead or an application owner. You'll have to get several levels of approval, and then you push that code, then your infrastructure gets changed. Now, if you see in the several demos what I was working on, I was making a lot of changes left and right in my services. I used to configure, I used to come back to code commit, but normally you cannot do that in an IR environment. If you want to make any changes, everything has to go through the code. When you do a manually, now one of the manual is I was working on a different region, right? That's a manual error, but that will not occur when you go through the code, because in the code the region details will be mentioned clearly, right? That is why infrastructure as a code will eliminate the manual configuration and manual errors, and it also increases speed and agility, right? And AWS configuration is one of the key tool for implementing the infrastructure as a code. From the AWS side, so this is the service which will help you to achieve the infrastructure as a code. So there are several services like Terraform outside AWS. You can also use that if you want to. It is not like AWS will not integrate it. It can be integrated with AWS, but it's always recommended, and it is more beneficial if you use CloudFormation, because you're gonna get a lot of benefits of using CloudFormation for your applications running on AWS.
So, guys, this was our expert from Team K21 Academy. And if you want to dive deeper to any concept, then we have something really, really, really special for you. We have our free class on AWS DevOps for Beginners certification along with some demo. In this free class, you'll be learning about why learn DevOps and on AWS Cloud, what is AWS DevOps, who should be learning about it, CI/CD pipelines. You'll be getting a demo. You'll also be getting some hands-on labs and job opportunities as well. So, in order to register for this free class, all you have to do is just log on to k21academy.com/AWS DevOps 02. And after that, you'll be seeing this kind of interface. You just have to click on book your free seat now and add your event date according to your availability, enter your name, your email address, your phone number, and click on yes, save my seat. Moving ahead, you'll be seeing this kind of URL on the extreme right. Save that URL, and I will see you in the free class. Till then, keep learning.